Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa sallam ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Hello, thank you for inviting me for this very important discussion about the war and terror and how it impacts on everybody here in this room, including myself, even though I am not a resident or a citizen of this country. When I was first invited to come to Sweden to discuss Sweden's counterterrorism policies and laws that are being proposed, I was quite surprised because I assumed that, like most of Europe, those laws were already in place, like we have in the UK. So when I did a bit more research, I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that Sweden enjoys far more liberalism and far more freedoms that they've managed to preserve than the UK, the US, France, Italy, and many other countries. It came as a great shock to me that somebody could openly, and this is something that I've learned in the last few days being in Sweden and having these conversations with people, that it's okay to sit and talk about politics, talk about jihad, talk about what's happening in Syria, talk about even wanting to go to Syria, and without suddenly being arrested or having your door broken down or being threatened with deportation. In the UK, these things happen when you sort of begin to talk about these issues, and I'm going to explain why. It came as a shock to me that somebody could, in this country, go to somewhere like Somalia, join Al-Shabaab, and become a foot soldier for them and come back and not be prosecuted, because they have draw a distinction between doing that and engaging in an atrocity against civilians. Again, in the UK, to even raise the words Al-Shabaab, which in Arabic mean the youth, so the Arabs will use it a lot, but that could be deemed to be a criminal offense. So I am quite concerned that Sweden wants to replicate the UK's counterterrorism policies, because the UK has been using a sledgehammer approach to tackling extremism and terrorism for over 13 years. And yet, as we will see, it has not made UK a safer place. It has not stopped people joining terrorist groups. It has not stopped the stem of people going to fight in Syria. And the only response is, well, we need to do something harder than this. And yet again, we still have terrorist attacks happening, we still have terrorist attacks being foiled, so something is not working. By contrast, in Sweden, and I'm sure I will be corrected if I'm wrong in this, and I may well be wrong, but in the last 13 years, there has been one suicide bomb attack in Sweden in 2011, and almost a failed attack. But apart from that, there has been no significant plot in this country, either by people here or by people who've traveled abroad and come back and caused a problem. And I believe, and this is backed up by studies, that this is because Sweden is a more free society and is a more liberal society, and they still have a respect for civil liberties and human rights that the UK and the US has not anymore. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to share my experiences from the UK with you and in some way explain to you that should you carry on down this path and replicate the UK, that you will be allowing yourself to sleepwalk into a surveillance state, a state which will be more akin in the Soviet Union than in the European Union. So let's start by looking at UK legislation, then what we have, the prevent policy, which is the soft power that goes alongside with the legislation. And then I'm just going to take you through how that's been implemented in the Syria context, and finally how we should, the solutions that at CAGE we have been proposing to the government. So the misconception is that the anti-terrorism laws in the UK that are being used today came in after 9/11. This is not true. They came in February 2000. So a whole 18 months before 9/11 happened, we had these terrorism powers were introduced. They only began to be implemented, obviously, in a grand scale after 9/11. Now, what happened after 9/11 In the immediate aftermath, a new act was introduced which allowed the British government to intern foreign nationals. Internment meaning they could detain them indefinitely, without charge, without trial. Automatically, 19 foreign nationals who were deemed to be Al-Qaeda members or Al-Qaeda supporters were taken from their homes, transferred to a prison, a maximum security prison, and kept in detention indefinitely. For the next 3 years, these men were kept, and while we understand, and it is understandable, if somebody is accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda or a supporter, and 9/11 has just happened, that it makes sense to arrest them, to question them, to interrogate them, and if there's evidence, to prosecute them. What's incredible and completely unreasonable is that these men were detained for over 3 years and not asked a single question by the police, by the intelligence services, by any agency. They were asked about what they didn't even know why they were in, apart from the just thing that you are a terror suspect. So this was the first real infringement of civil liberties. That problem finally was litigated all the way to the House of Lords, the highest court in Britain at the time, and that ruled that this was unlawful because it discriminated against foreign nationals, because you couldn't intern a British citizen. So that was the only thing that was wrong with it, the court said. After that, the court ordered the men to be released, so the government immediately introduced what we call the control orders regime. This was effectively, the last time I can remember something like this would have been in apartheid South Africa with the banning orders. So control orders is a regime where you are put under 24-hour or 22-hour house arrest. You're not allowed to have a phone in your house. You're not allowed to have the internet in your house or a USB stick or any electronic communication device. You can't visit certain people. Nobody can visit your house without permission from the Home Office. You're not allowed to leave your house apart from a 1-mile barrier around your house. You can't go beyond that barrier. Your children, if their friends want to come to visit them, they need to get prior permission from the security services. So your children are not going to have too many friends coming around, one can imagine. You're restricted from who you can meet. You're restricted from what you can possess. You're restricted from where you can travel to. In some instances, control orders were used to prevent people from taking public transport. If you breach a control order, then you commit a criminal offense and you go to prison. Now, you're forced to wear an electronic tag on your ankle to monitor where you go, and you have to call the Home Office or the security services 3 or 4 times a night from a specially installed phone in your home to make sure that you're there. So every time you have to set your alarm, pick it up, call, and then put it down again. Then after 2 hours, call again. And this has the effect of completely destroying an individual and destroying the family. What's crucial here is these people are accused of the worst crimes, yet they've never been charged. They've never seen the evidence against them. They've never actually been prosecuted in a court of law, yet we are being punished worse than if they had been prosecuted and jailed. So much so that some of these men, they said we were better off when we were inside the Belmarsh prison, where they were detained without trial. There is a method to challenge these control orders, but it's through a shadowy court system called the Special Immigration Appeals Commission. In this system, you're not allowed to see the evidence against you. Your lawyer is not allowed to see the evidence against you. The only person who can see the evidence or the intelligence is a lawyer appointed by the system to represent you. But that lawyer cannot discuss that information with you or your personal lawyer. But they just have to try to argue it without taking your instructions. As a lawyer, I find this very, very difficult to comprehend and a complete breach of due process. But the British government said we need to do this to tackle terrorism. So they had this issue. After many years of litigation, of campaigning, this was finally done away with, but it was replaced with something called Terrorism Preventative Investigative Measures, TPIMs. Essentially, we call this control orders light, or diet control orders, because it just changed the house arrest to a 16-hour curfew rather than 24 hours. They had limited access to mobile phones, to the internet, and after 2 years they would expire unless there was more evidence. So they were initially brought in, but at the moment nobody is under a TPIM because they couldn't prove any evidence against them. After the London attacks in 2005, again, there was a need, okay, what we had so far, the internment, the control orders, this didn't stop terrorism, so let's ignore the elephant in the room that's named foreign policy, and let's bring in more anti-terrorism laws. So they brought in a new terrorism act. This new terrorism act brought in the offense of glorifying terrorism. So now if you basically were to glorify terrorism, or this would be seen as encouraging it, this was a crime. It brought in the offense of having a terrorist publication without any definition of what that is, but it is a terrorist publication. So the courts would later interpret this. You could be the most widely implemented measure nowadays is the preparation for terrorism. This is a catch-all. So this is Section 5 of the Terrorism Act 2006. Preparation for terrorism means anything. So in the Syria context, what we're seeing is people who have booked a flight to Turkey are being convicted of terrorism because they assume that those people will then go into Syria. People who have basically gone to the gym are being accused under Preparation Act that you are preparing yourself for jihad. People who are reading books, who are, it covers anything. You can just use your imagination. Anything that you can see that will be a step towards the actual act of terrorism is preparation for terrorism. So we have a case in the UK of Masood al-Chowdhury. He was the first Syria-related terrorism conviction. This man went to Syria. He stayed there for 2 weeks, and then he came back. The prosecution admitted in court that we do not know what he did in Syria. We have no evidence that he was involved in fighting. We have no evidence of who he met. But we assume he went there to join Islamic State, or ISIS as it was back then. So he should be prosecuted, and he was convicted. This man, when he came back to the police station when he got arrested, and he broke down. He said, I saw horrible things there. And he broke down, he cried, he had mental health problems. If anything, this man should have been used as a way to tell people that, this is why you shouldn't go to Syria. But instead, what did they do? They prosecuted him. Now he's awaiting probably a very heavy, lengthy sentence for a 2-week stint in Syria where they can't actually prove or admit that he actually was involved in anything, even conflict related. Now, other powers that have been coming in have been this issue about detention at ports of entry and exit to the UK. This has been around for the last 10 years, 11 years. Schedule 7. This means you can be stopped at an airport and questioned for up to 7 hours, previously 9 hours, and until recently, until this year, in fact, without a solicitor. The border agency do not need any suspicion. They do not need to have reasonable suspicion. They can just detain you on profiling and ask you as many questions as they want to establish whether you are a terror suspect. So people have been asked about what mosque you go to, how many times you pray, what your wife's name is, what school your children go to, what your opinions are about voting, who did you vote for in the last election, things that we take for granted that are confidential. It's come to this stage where people have been asked how many times you have intercourse with your wife. This is the type, just to get a reaction and to try to see, I don't know what kind of profile they're trying to create, but this is what they're doing. And the same people are getting profiled left, right, and center. I think in the last year, over 75,000 people were Schedule 7 in this way, stopped at the Schedule 7 in 1 year. 75,000 people, and the vast majority of them were Muslims. So really, if you're talking about criminalizing a community and trying to stop terrorism, the net is expanding wider and wider, but the problem is not being solved. Now, most recently with the Syria crisis, all these measures have not worked so far. So they've had to go a step further. So they've talked about confiscating people's passports, depriving them of citizenship, so that to leave them stateless, so that you're left basically without the right to have rights. And now, most recently, they're talking about bringing in that medieval crime of treason against the Crown. So let's think about this. Somebody goes to Syria to fight against Assad, or to fight with ISIS against Kurds or the Yazidis. Whatever our opinion about the rights and wrongs of those actions, how is that a crime against Britain? How is that a crime against the Crown? How are you betraying your loyalty to Britain? It doesn't make sense. But the problem is that once you've gone to this level and you say that, what's left? After treason, what is left? What is next year's measure going to be? Will they bring back the death penalty to deal with these people? Is that the direction they're going? So this is the problem. When you have such a very hard approach to these matters, there's no going back because you're stuck in that process. If this isn't working, let's try a harder hammer. Not working, let's get a bigger hammer. And that essentially is the problem at the moment. Coupled with this now is the soft power. That's the hard power, the legal issues. Soft power is the counter-terrorism policies that we have come to know as PREVENT. Could I just see by show of hands how many people have heard of the UK PREVENT policy? Okay, not many. Okay, it's very important that we learn about this because your government wants to try to implement this in Sweden, and you need to know what this involves. PREVENT, or preventing violent extremism, later known as preventing extremism, and then now it's PREVENT. This was part of the government strategy to tackle terrorism that came in 2004. So it's been around over a decade. And what it essentially involves is trying to socially engineer a Islam that is palatable to the government, something that they are comfortable with. It might not, when we see the final product, we might not call it Islam, but it's something that they are quite happy with. Now, what it seeks to do is to handpick what they would call moderate Muslims and utilize them to further the agenda. The problem with this definition of moderate and extremist is it's very relative. So somebody who is extremist today will be moderate tomorrow, and vice versa. In a UK case, for example, for many years, between 2005 and about 2011, many Libyan dissidents who were trying to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi were persecuted in Britain to the extent that they were jailed, put under these control orders, harassed, and the only reason being is that we understand you're not a threat to this country, but you are trying to overthrow Gaddafi, and that constitutes terrorism because he's the state, he's the head of state, and you're trying to overthrow him. So these people were imprisoned and persecuted because they were deemed to be extremist, because Gaddafi was our government's friend at the time. 2011, these very same people went back to Libya and were fighting with the assistance of the British government, engaged in actual fighting against Gaddafi to overthrow him. And one of these men rose to such a position that he was the personal bodyguard for Hillary Clinton and President Erdogan when they went to Libya. So they're moderate today. The PKK have been an extremist terrorist organization for many years and banned in Britain and prosecuted. Today, they are heroes. We all saying, let's go join the PKK. So that's why this terminology does not fit. You cannot prosecute people. You cannot implement anti-terrorism legislation and ruin people's life based on the politics of the day. You have to have, it's immoral to do that. For the law to be effective, it needs to be clear. It cannot be vague and depending on which government is in power of the day. Now, this PREVENT project received, in the last 10 years, hundreds of millions of pounds was invested in this project. And its objectives that it stated were to challenge the ideology behind violent extremism, to disrupt those who promote violent extremism, to support individuals who are vulnerable to recruitment, to address grievances, to develop supporting intelligence, and to improve communications. What it did, though, was, that sounds very vague and very nice, but what the government did was they began to push this strategy through a department which is called the Department for Communities and Local Governance. What this department is responsible for, or should be responsible for, is promoting community cohesions, positive, getting communities together, helping communities develop, integrating them. When that policy is seen through the counter-terrorism prism, then we are going to have problems, because it creates what is effectively a suspect community. So the PREVENT funding, when a table was made, it was given in direct proportion. The amount that you got to each local authority and municipality received was in direct proportion to the number of Muslims in the area. So clearly it wasn't there to, although they said we were using it to deal with far-right extremism and animal rights extremists, it was only for the Muslims in essence. Since 2005, over 100 million has been given to 94 municipalities to develop over 1,000 schemes. Now, some people say, well, what's so wrong about that? They're just helping the Muslim community develop. They're using them to set up youth clubs and set up mosques. And women's rights groups. There's nothing wrong with this. It's government funding. We're British citizens. It should be allowed. What's wrong with this? What's wrong with it is that this money comes through a counterterrorism prism, unlike any other community. So the Sikh community, the Hindu community, the white community, the black community, they don't get this funding through this. They have other departments to apply for funding. But for the Muslim community, the only way you got funding was to apply through Prevent. The second problem with Prevent is a strings-tied policy. So you have to, when you get your funding, use that funding to assist Prevent in countering extremism, as they defined it. Now, I'll give you an example. There was a youth center wanted to be, a community group wanted to set up a youth center in one of the northern towns. Now, what they said was, in this youth center, we're going to have a gym, we're going to have an internet cafe, we're going to help the youth, we're going to have sports activities, religious activities. But that wasn't good enough. You had to link to the bid for the money, you had to link how you're going to actually help Prevent. So what they said was, when we have the internet cafe, we can monitor what websites our youth are going on, and then we can keep a database and send it to you. We'll have a register of all the youth in the area, and we can share that with the MI5, MI6 intelligence services. Now, these are youth workers who are suddenly becoming intelligence agents. Anybody who's worked with youth will understand how dangerous this is, because you're trying to reach out to kids in gangs and crime, and if they believe that you're part of, it's passing on their personal information, and that relationship of trust and confidence is gone then. So how can you actually, you're alienating those youth even more, because you have to give basically the rationale for the funding. Another requirement in the Prevent strategy, and I'll quote this, is for local authorities, the municipalities, to have a sophisticated understanding of local Muslim communities, including strong knowledge and their makeup, including different ethnic groups, denominations, social and economic status, elected representatives, community leaders, knowledge of location and denomination of mosques, awareness of community groups. Why would a local authority need to have that information about any community, if it's not for intelligence purposes and mapping exercises in this way? So what Prevent is doing is, it's okay to engage, but we want to engage with a positive focus, not an engage that we're here to stop you people from becoming bad. Because it gives an idea that within every Muslim there's a dormant terrorist, that unless we protect him and give him all this funding and give him a youth center, that he will inevitably become a terrorist at some point. And the other problem with this in terms of community cohesion is that other groups will see this, and they have seen this, and they've become critical, saying, why are Muslims getting this money? Just because, are we going to turn to suicide bombing so we can get money as well? So it's creating divisions within the communities within the UK, which is problematic. Now, if you can imagine a pyramid structure, right? And at the top, the 3 layers. The top layer is the violent extremists. This is the people that they want to prosecute and arrest and do everything else to. The middle layer is what they call people who are radicalizers, or people who sympathize with extremist ideology. And they're the people they say we want to catch before they become terrorists. We want to intervene. So these are the people who are critical of foreign policy, who have funny political views. They believe in Sharia, or they believe in having a caliphate, or they believe homosexuality is wrong. These are the people we need to intervene and stop them. And then the bottom layer is the entire Muslim community. And they're saying, what they say is that we need to use this bottom layer to intervene with the middle layer. The problem is when the bottom layer say, look, you do your job, let me do my job. I'm a doctor, let me treat patients. You're an intelligence agent, you spy on people. But when they basically do this, they get pushed into the middle layer as frustrating the process, or maybe you are a sympathizer as well, and they get pushed into the middle layer. So overall, you have this demonization of the entire community. And the head of the UK's Office of Security and Counterterrorism, Charles Farr, he summed up the strategy as this. He says, we target a much larger group who feel a degree of negativity, if not hostility towards the state, the country, the community, and who are, as it were, the pool in which terrorists can swim. So that's what he defines as the Muslim community, is a pool in which terrorists can swim, so we need to basically use them to actually throw out the terrorists. Now, in 2009, the Prevent strategy escalated dramatically with the introduction of what was called Contest 2. That's the name of the strategy. So previously, the Prevent measures were about having a discussion with these people about their views and say, trying to dissuade them. So the young people who are interested in jihad and traveling, we can try to engage them and dissuade them and intervene. After 2009, the youth workers were reporting that they've changed their policy. They're more heavy-handed now. Now they're saying, you will support the British troops in Afghanistan. You will oppose, these terrorist troops. You will do this. They're being told what to think, what to say, which again is problematic. So what the government said was, it's this ideology of what they call Islamism, which is to believing in Islam as a social system, as a way of life, as a political governance system. Even though that itself is not criminal and that's not terrorism, that is the ideology that in which this terrorism is festering. So they say we need to basically tackle this ideology and stop this in some way. Now this is the biggest mistake with Prevent, is they're trying to tackle an ideology. Terrorism is not an ideology, terrorism is a methodology. Islam, or Islamism as they call it, is the ideology, and you can't tackle it. So when you expand the factors from blowing up civilians, which everybody condemns, to defending your land, which some condemn and some justify, to believing in the concept of jihad as a principle of Islam, to believing that women, as a woman, that I should cover my face or cover my hair, or as a man I should wear a beard, or that believing as a Muslim that we believe, like Jews and Christians, that homosexuality is wrong. When those factors suddenly become equated with the first factor, blowing up civilians, then we've got a problem. Then you are demonizing the entire religion, and that is what is essentially happening. Because Prevent is there to effectively, and the Times of London reported this and described it as such, as the greatest social engineering project. A social engineering project. Asma Jahangir, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religious belief, in her UK report a few years ago, she said the same thing, that it's not for the government to dictate the terms of the religion to anybody. And she was talking about the UK government in that report. Now, again, I'm just going to give you another quote from Charles Farr, which highlights this point, when he talks about what's extremist. He says there's views in some quarters here that Western culture is evil and the Muslims living in this country should not engage with Western cultural organizations, or, for want of a better term, with Western culture itself. There's nothing violent about that, and it is not necessarily going to lead to terrorism. But it does seem to me to be unreal for this or any other government not to say that they are going to challenge that, and that there's no more nor less than what this government is now saying. Now, we've engaged with a lot of youth workers, and what they tell us the most frightening aspect of this is that, they're afraid to listen to their communities now. They're afraid to listen to youth to come and have problems. Why? Because they feel they have to report it now. And this is what I'm going to get onto, is about the issue about surveillance. This is the key issue of Prevent. So it's one thing to have these policies in and trying to persuade people to change their beliefs and system. It's another thing where you make that a almost criminal offense, that it has to be reported. So if the government have MI5 in this building, or SAPO, or whoever it is in this country, in this building, and they're monitoring us and they're listening to me, fine, that's their job. They get paid to do that. They have to show how they can justify those big paychecks. But when my doctor is reporting me because I'm reporting something to him about my health, or something in my family, or my university lecturer reports me, or my child's kindergarten teacher reports her, or your fireman who comes to fix a safety alarm reports you for a book you have on your shelf, then you tend to get a bit worried. But this is what Prevent is trying to do. It has introduced this policy measure, which the government now is saying must become law. So it becomes a legal obligation on service providers to report signs of extremism, signs of radicalization. And the signs of radicalization are very bizarre. A person who grows a beard, a person has certain books about political Islam on his bookshelf, or about jihad. A person is very critical of foreign policy. A person believes this is a war on Islam, this intervention in Muslim lands. And these are all, there's nothing, is there anything criminal in anything I've said at the moment? If I was not a Muslim and I grew a beard, that would be okay? If I was a lefty, anarchist who was holding up saying these governments are evil, that would be okay. But as a Muslim, suddenly it becomes a radicalizing factor. Now, they've been rolling across this training in the health sector, in the education sector, in the emergency services sector. A fireman told me, a personal friend of mine, how the Prevent came to them and said, when you fix a safety alarm in the homes, look at the bookshelves and see what books there are there, and then check if they're extremist. And he said, he's the only Muslim on the unit. So one of the non-Muslims said, well, look, if we find books about explosives or we see something, we will, of course, report it. You know, as just normal, decent human beings, that's what we do. We're not going to, because we're going to have to go into these homes, and it's going to affect us. And he goes, no, it's more complex than that. And he started putting up books, and the books were books by Sayyid Qutb, books by Abdullah Azam, traditional books of fiqh, of Sharia, books about political Islam. You know, stuff that probably many people have on their bookshelves. Not in a criminal way, but these are classical texts. And these were suddenly being criminalized as signs. Now, what you're also doing is, whereas the MI5, the SAPU, the CIA, they have a more nuanced understanding of these issues. They study the issue. They can hopefully draw distinctions between what is, you know, real Al-Qaeda, what's ISIS, what's Muslim Brotherhood. For the normal fireman or nurse or doctor or teacher, they don't know these things. They're going to just go by their understanding of what they read in the newspaper and what they see on TV. So if they see something that says jihad, they might think, oh my gosh, I need to report this, or I'm going to be committing a criminal offense. So you have effectively made the service providers the eyes and ears of the intelligence. And people are not happy about this. Let me tell you this. We get so many complaints from nurses, doctors, lecturers, and the firemen. We're all upset about this. They said, we want to help people. We don't want to become spies. If we want to become spies, we would have joined the MI5 and got a better salary. But we came and we want to help people do what we do. And they're upset. They say, we want to treat patients. We don't want to have to spy on them. So somebody comes to a doctor and says, yeah, you know, I'm feeling depressed and I feel like traveling and I'm upset about what's happening to Muslims around the world and I don't know. I don't know what to do. Sometimes I think, you know, I should join them. And this is what you do with your doctor. It's how it's therapy. You talk to them. But this now, suddenly the doctor now has to think, should I report this man? Should I not report him? I'll be committing a criminal offense. Universities. We've had a case where a PhD student, a Muslim PhD student, doing his thesis on Al-Qaeda, and his university lecturer, who is also a Muslim, told him, well, sent him an email link to the Al-Qaeda training manual, which could be downloaded from the US State Department website. He downloads it, he prints it off. The university report the two of them to the police. They're raided, they're taken into custody, they're detained for 14 days. He's charged. Eventually everything is dropped and he sued them and he got compensation. But the point being is that, let's think about this. Terrorism is everyone's talking about it. Terrorism studies is more popular than ever before. So how can a Muslim engage in terrorism studies at university without drawing suspicion on himself? You know, what about chemistry students? You know, what if a teacher is to see a chemistry student and he comes in and maybe someday he starts to wear his Islamic dress to university, wears a beard? Okay, chemistry, you know, he could be doing something with those chemicals. Should I report him? But this is the paranoia. We saw this. We've seen this. We've seen this in Britain we've seen this in the UK in the past with communists, with the Japanese. This has happened, and it's scary that it's happening again. And this is all coming through the Prevent situation. I think one of the most scariest things I've heard was nurseries. I kid you not. We had an episode recently called the Trojan Horse episode. I don't know if you heard about it, where Muslim schools were investigated for teaching extremism and not doing enough to stop extremism. At the end of the day, all of it was just mud. None of it stuck. But a huge debate happened. And the government report on this, they said that we identified 2 nurseries which were not doing enough to counter extremism. How many people have children there in kindergarten or nursery? You know, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. You know, it's you have you. How could you, if you were to advise in the kindergarten, I want you to do something to stop them being exposed to extremism? You know, what would you do? You know, I've got kids in nursery. I can't even think what, because all they do is they sing songs, they rhymes, do a bit of dancing. They watch some cartoons, they do some playing with Play-Doh and arts and craft. So I don't understand this, but this is what's happening now. They are going for even nurseries. On the way here, we were discussing about, in America, they have a theory called green diaper babies. And green diaper babies are the babies who are born in families known to be supportive of jihad. So they said these are green diaper babies, you need to monitor them from the beginning. Because the green is the color of Islam, and so the diapers are nappy, so these are green diaper babies. This is it's frightening. It's quite funny, but at the same time it's frightening because these are policymakers who are coming up with these proposals. Okay, so what happens when someone's sent to, an intervention is made? Someone intervenes, I recognize someone, I report him to prevent. There was an incident in Manchester, by way of a case study, where so I'm just looking at time-wise, where an individual was attended a demonstration with the Israeli ambassador, was visiting his university. He was a young kid, 17 years old. He wasn't Muslim, so he had a Muslim name. He had one parent was Muslim, one wasn't. He wasn't very practicing as a Muslim, wasn't very devout. But he protested outside the embassy, and at one point they went towards the car with the placards. He got arrested. They were all released eventually, but so when he got home, Prevent had been to his house. They'd been to his relative's house. They said, we're worried that he's going to be involved in extremism. No one else in the demonstration received his treatment except for this young kid because he had a Muslim name. The Prevent officers used to visit him at school while he's hanging around with his friends and ask him the names of his friends. They would go into, when the teacher was organizing a trip to the Tory party conference, a Conservative party conference, annual conference, to bring in the whole class. They actually went in and they said he can't go because he might be exposed to extremism. I don't know what they think about the Tories, but maybe that view is shared by many, but I think it's still wrong that he couldn't go on to a conference on politics. And this carried on for 2 years. He said, my life was held. People coming in, checking what subjects I'm studying, what I'm doing, who I'm hanging about with. Nobody wanted to be my friend anymore. But this is essentially what an intervention means. And they will carry on to make sure you don't become a violent extremist. What we need to do, we need to engage with the youth. But youth will only be empowered and engaged where there's no strings, where there's no strings attached, where it's not linked to counterterrorism, where it's not linked to surveillance. There needs to be space, and this is why I really admire Sweden as the space for democratic discussion. If you can't discuss the politics of what's going on in the world in your mosque, with your doctor, in your university, with your friends, without being reported to the authorities, where are you going to? Where's all this frustration going to go? You can't get it out because you'll be reported. So you have to go. Where are you going to go? Go on the internet. Go somewhere else. No one's going to be able to guide you. If you do have bad intentions, no one is going to be able to guide you in a good, positive way to channel that. So we had a meeting with some people yesterday in Sweden, and one of the imams was saying how someone contacted him about his son, worried that he was he was convinced to go to Syria. In UK, if that person was reported to the police, he would be in prison right now. Here, this imam went and he spent, I think he said, 9 hours with him, and he finally convinced him not to go. But it was done on a very private basis, without any government telling him, without any funding, without implementing a government agenda, and that's why it had more sincerity, and that's why it worked. In UK, he would have been in prison, his life ruined, over, finished. He would have come out of prison and he would be bitter. What do you think he would have done? Best years of his life gone because he wanted to go help his brothers and sisters in Syria. What kind of bitterness does that engender later on? And we need to look at the long-term effects of these policies. I'm conscious of time, and I know that time was left for questions and answers. I'm just going to fast forward to issues about Syria. Since Syria sort of became a bad war in 2013, the government have relaunched Prevent with a vengeance. And they have tried to say that everything to do with Prevent needs to be implemented across the board and become legislation now. What they're saying is that these people go abroad, they come back, and they will carry out atrocities in the UK. There is absolutely not an iota of evidence to support this thesis of blowback. Of the 2 terrorism plots which involve people who had gone abroad of the 66 terrorism plots in the UK, only 2 involved people who had actually gone abroad and come back. And those were actually engaged in very, very different, unique scenarios. But Britain has a history of Muslims traveling to Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Libya, most recently, and coming back and going back to their day jobs, school runs, everything. There's never been an issue. So why now are they saying that there's a blowback issue? There is no evidence to support this argument. What is happening, though, is when people do come back, they're automatically being imprisoned. They're being threatened to have their citizenship taken away. They're being killed in airstrikes. What is happening is gruesome if you want to think about this. Not just for the individuals affected, but as a society, we need to see where are we going with this. At what point does this end? Now we're on treason. It could be the death sentence next. In Sweden, in Denmark, they have a very good system. In Denmark, of all the foreign fighters who have returned, not a single one has gone to prison. They have actually treated them for their physical injuries. They've treated them for their psychological injuries. They've encouraged them to carry on speaking about the politics, believing in jihad. Said, you do what you want. Talk about jihad, talk about politics, talk about these issues, because you need to get it out and discuss it. And they have that space for discussion. Where you don't have that space, like the UK, then you will create problems. So what we say is that returning fighters, because people, understand this, people go for a variety of reasons. Not everybody goes and joins ISIS and does beheadings. People go to Syria, there's hundreds of groups there. People go and fight Assad, as they went to fight Gaddafi, as they went to fight in Bosnia. They go and they fight a good war, as people are now describing the PKK war. They go to fight that war, and they shouldn't be criminalized for doing so. If there's evidence that they have committed atrocities with any group, whoever that group is, then they should be prosecuted if there's evidence. But apart from that, they should be allowed to come back, and in the Danish model, they should be spoken to, whatever, but they shouldn't be harassed and criminalized as they are doing so now. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot to speak about. I'm sure it'll come up in Q&A, but I'll just say is that Syria is at a very, very critical point in its history. And from the little that I know, and I know I'm very little education about the situation here, but what I do know is that it even feels freer here than Britain. And your policies are working. The policies in Sweden seem to be working. I understand that Swedish fighters went to many countries and have come back, and there's never been an attack in this country, apart from the one failed attack. And Britain, despite all these measures, these laws, these policies, the surveillance state, they still can't control this problem. So let's not be knee-jerk, let's look at policies that actually work. And I believe that Denmark is a good example to follow. It's closer to home, it's your neighbors. You don't need to go to UK, you can just follow your neighbors. Thank you for listening. And I'm sure there's questions you can ask me.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to, nu kommer vi gå vidare till att Bror Kitimba kommer ställa lite frågor till föreläsaren som kommer att svara på dem, och sen på slutet så kanske vi släpper in publiken också så de får ställa lite frågor.